welcome to America at its Best. My name is Rebecca Painter and I'll be your host for today's show. We launched this show right around the time the economy started shutting down states across our country. And we knew that there would be challenges ahead of us. I don't think we knew we'd be quite where we are today. It's been a really hard few months. But I want to remind you guys that we started the show because we wanted you to see good things that were happening, things you can't find when you just turn on your local or national news. And these good things are happening because of you. So I ask that you remember for the next 45 minutes that this is all about you finding a little bit of optimism in the ways that you're having a hand in shaping the future of our country at a time that's, well, unprecedented, at least in my lifetime. So thank you for being here today with us. Today, we'll be covering one of my favorite topics, which is the ways State Policy Network is taking power away from DC and returning it to the states. We'll be joined by Jennifer Butler, who is a senior policy advisor at State Policy Network, and our friend Jim Vogel. Jim is the CEO of the Platt Institute in Nebraska. Jennifer and Jim, welcome to the show.
Hi.
Great to be here.
We are so glad to have you here. We will get to you guys in just a couple of minutes. First, let's check in with the fearless leader of State Policy Network, Ms. Tracy Sharp, coming to us from California. Tracy, how are you today?
Hey, Rebecca, it's great to be here. As you alluded to in your opening comments, we came into June amidst developments that continue to keep this country in a state of flux and crisis. For sure, there's a lot that we need to work on, a lot that needs to be fixed. But I want to also remind our viewers why we called this series America at its Best. It's because we believe in the problem-solving power in communities, that proximity matters, proximity to the problem, and solving those problems closer to home. We feel like this network is well situated. The leaders on this call, the leaders in this network live and work in communities. Therefore, they have a vested interest in helping them to heal, to helping them find compassionate solutions. So the topic today about making sure that state voices are heard in DC is very timely. And I look forward to hearing the ideas and just the inspiration and optimism that could come from our speakers. So Rebecca, with that, I'll turn it over to you to get things started.
Okay, Tracy, thank you. Let me ask you before we go to the speakers though, because I think, well, I know you've been in this game for a little bit longer than I have. Is this something new that SPN's been working in the federal space, or has this been going on a while?
Well, yes, for sure. Federalism is baked into our DNA here at SPN. And looking back through the years, I recall a decade ago, we launched a program called Federalism in Action, and we were able to gain just tremendous support. Some of the donors on this call were very helpful in that. And we wanted to put someone in charge of that who could get things done. And that person was Jennifer Butler. And now she handles all of our federal programs. For over a decade, that's really evolved and grown. It's such an important part of what we do. Like I said, it's baked into our DNA here of believing that problems are better solved at the state and local level. So I'm looking forward to both what Jim and Jennifer are gonna enlighten us with today.
Sounds good. Thank you, Tracy. Well, with that wonderful introduction, let's turn to you, Jennifer.
Hi.
Again, now, Tracy talked about how we've been at this for a while. Can you help us understand why SPN, we're focused on state solutions? So what are we doing up at the White House exactly? What's our role?
Taking a step back, right? We are a network of organizations, state level organizations focused on freedom. So, it is absolutely critical we remain eternally vigilant just about the size and scope of Washington, D.C., because it impacts, unfortunately, every facet of people's everyday lives. So we launched this program several years ago, just with 3 goals in mind. 1, continuing to grow awareness about just the ever-growing overreach of the federal government. The second is engaging states to action. That's very powerful. And third is just making changes on the federal level. There's been lots of opportunities over the last few years is to roll back just burdensome regulations and even stop really bad policies such as ending due skim, right, where unions were skimming money off Medicaid payments that should have been going to home health care workers.
Okay, wow. So then tell us a little bit more about what we're doing right now to bring state voices to the administration in order to help people in light of the pandemic.
Well, it has been definitely a very intense last 3 months. So it's important to remember how the federal government is handling the pandemic response. They have a kind of saying they use, but it really does encapsulate just how they are handling it. It's federally advised, state-led, and locally implemented. So most of the decisions, a slew of the decisions, are happening at the state level. So it's really important that state-level policy organizations such as our network have a seat at the table. This pandemic, COVID has not impacted every state the same way. It has not impacted every city, every county the same way. So it's absolutely critically important that you don't have a one-size-fits-all policy, whether it's dealing with healthcare, access to healthcare, or even to just economic recovery coming from Washington, D.C. So we have been meeting with White House officials, vice presidents' offices, advising agencies, just on what is happening on the ground in response to COVID, both healthcare and economic recovery.
So Jen, let me stop you right there. We'll get back to that in just a minute in terms of what's happening on the ground. But look, there's no delicate way to say this. There have been confusing messages for sure coming out of the White House, particularly in the last few months. At the same time, you mentioned some pretty philosophical aligned folks who actually are coming to you saying, what can we do to make this easier on the states and empower them to do things the way that's best for their local folks? Can you be more specific about who exactly we're talking with? I know you mentioned the vice president's office. Are the rest of them just Hill staffers or are these top administration folks?
This administration came in and they did bring in a lot of people from Washington, D.C. think tanks and even to our state level think tanks too. So there are a lot of serious-minded policy folks that are embedded in this administration. And yes, the messages have been confusing. This has been a beyond confusing time and continuously is so. But there are some, as I said, serious policy folks that have been networking and contacting with our folks. I think it's important to remember, I live in Washington, D.C. I'm in a bubble. I guarantee you the news, the conversations I have are probably a lot different than a lot of the people in real America that are watching the show have on a daily basis. So it's important that those folks, even people too that have been involved in this movement are connected with folks that are outside that bubble, that have a better understanding of what's happening on the ground, how these policies are impacting real people on the ground.
So what kind of issue areas do the folks who are within the administration want state voice and state input on?
Well, it's definitely ebbed and flowed. I'll tell you right now, probably a lot of the focus is just on what's happened and the impact of the almost $3 trillion that have been appropriated thus far in the 4 major packages that Congress has passed. I can't believe you're using the words trillion these days. It's kind of shocking. But a lot of that money, basically almost $1 trillion is being appropriated to states, to local governments, and even to community-based services. So it's important they understand the impact it's having and also to what states are doing, both the good and the bad, to deal with the economic crisis. I'd love to give 2 examples of states because I think it illustrates the beauty and the pain of federalism. So I'll give you this example of Illinois. Illinois just passed a budget, and most states are cutting. Illinois decided to do things differently. They decided to increase spending 6%. So they're basically planning to be $6 billion out of budget. How are they planning to pay for this? Their assumptions in the budget is that they're going to get a loan from the Federal Reserve, and they're going to pay that loan from a federal bailout in the future. Plus, while they were at it, they gave themselves an $1,800 pay raise.
Wow.
With
That's bold.
Yeah, it was bold. Yeah, that's Illinois. But not every state's Illinois, right? You contrast that with a state like Georgia, Healthy Rainy Day Fund. They're making significant cuts across the board, every nook and cranny of that state budget. And it's really important that our folks on the ground can share that information. There's definitely been a larger and growing call for more money, more federal bailouts, more money going to local governments. And we know federalism works. And when more money comes down from the federal government, money that my grandkids are going to have to pay off, it's going to drown out states being able to make good choices for their local constituency.
So that covers the CARES Act. What about in areas of healthcare and the economy? For example, has anybody been asking for state input in terms of liability on businesses who are opening and what that could mean?
That's a great question. You know, McConnell about a month ago said that was his number one priority. There's definitely a lot of questions as to the constitutionality of liability. And it's critical. Like, imagine you are a business owner, right? You're opening up your business. There's a significant amount of liability, even if you follow every sort of rule and regulation when it comes to health and protecting your customers and your employees from contracting COVID. You're opening yourself. And it's a sticking point to getting economies open. So McConnell said it's a priority. I think they're recognizing now that, one, states are already in the process of doing that. And two, you know, this is probably handled better on a state level than on a federal level. So that's definitely a conversation that we've been having, updating the administration on how liability and tort reform, right, are moving through in different states.
And the issue of healthcare, is there any movement around that right now?
There is. You know, that was definitely the first thing that the administration did. And I'm pleased to say, I think from a deregulation standpoint and moving forward, taking away any sort of barrier that they could identify that they had control over to give people access to healthcare, it was fantastic. But you know what? There's only so much the federal government has control over. So, you know, things like Medicare, they were able to open up the idea of telehealth, access to doctors on the internet. A lot of states then follow suit. A lot of our state think tanks were part of this discussion of figuring out how to handle that and open up deregulations on the state level so folks get access to care.
So if you had to point to, and I imagine for you this changes on a daily basis, today, the most pressing issue where the federal government is looking for state voice, what would it be?
I think it really is the question as to what is going to happen from additional money going to states. That's one. The second one is what sort of additional stimulus is needed in court to encourage employers to bring back employees. There's some discussion that in July there will be I think we're up to 5 now, a 5th major package dealing with encouraging employers to bring back employees and taking a look at some of the programs that have incentivized people getting back to work, like for instance, the expanded employment insurance. And you know what, we're gonna be right there, part of the conversation, getting information from our dynamic network just to show, right, and illustrate the fact that not every state handles things the same way. And so we need to be cognizant of that when we're looking at any sort of federal policy.
Yeah, the thing I keep hearing you say is basically there is no one size fits all. And that's the message you want to resonate with the folks up on the field.
Definitely. And I think we're countering a lot of voices that are painting states and local governments and how states should handle these sort of funds that are coming to them. And Jim's going to talk more about that in a moment, just with a broad brush. Really quick story. I was invited to brief, I'll just say who they are because I think this is a public record, on record, Larry Kudlow, who's assistant to the president for economic policy, and Kevin Hazlitt, who's also the advisor for economic policy, just with a small group of organizations that represent state governments and local governments. And the question was, what sort of additional federal stimulus is needed? Mm-hmm. The lone voice on there that was talking about, hey, you know what, we're not just going to ask for additional money. We need to step back and take a look at the fact that these economic projections aren't static. States are opening up. We're seeing economies starting to open up. States have rainy day funds that they can use. And so being able to provide this dynamic picture and serve as a warning when everybody else is saying we need more money really is only available and we can only do that with this dynamic network.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, final question before we move on to Jim. And by the way, before I ask my final question, I want to remind our viewers to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen at any time if you got a question for any of us, and we'll get to those towards the end of the show. All right, Jed, so you've given us a great idea of where we've been, where we are. In terms of where we're going and what's ahead, you haven't mentioned education yet. So do you see any focus on education in the future? And are there other issue areas aside from education where you expect to be hot in the coming months?
Well, I'm a mom. I have a 10-year-old and a 9-year-old, and it has been a busy time. I'm not only working in this sort of work, but also dealing with my kids. So those of you out there, God bless you all over the last few months.
So you've been homeschooling them yourself through COVID, I imagine?
Yes.
While you're doing the federal work, this lady she looks like Superwoman, and she is. There you go.
It's been fun. We do what we got to do. But we also have to recognize that, as we start going back to school in the fall, there really is a potential that the virus could come back. So our network of state policy education experts came together several weeks ago and put together a list of very serious policy ideas that can be moved forward on the federal level that advance school choice, but are based on free market principles and not that one size fits all. I think they were able to get ahead of the curve and start having some great discussions with the White House, with some of our friends in Congress. So that's one. Two, we're dealing with some serious issues right now on the federal level, and some important conversations to be having. And so I think things about policing, that is definitely going to be a part of the discussion too. And I think these are healthy discussions. I'm excited to see where Congress takes it. And also too, what's happening on the state level. So that's something that we're going to be keeping an eye on, just given the fact that many of our groups work on criminal justice reform and just bringing greater accountability to government systems like the police.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. All right, we will get back to Jen in a few minutes for Q&A. And again, it's right at the bottom of your screen, so please jump in with questions. Let's turn over to Jim Vogel from Nebraska Platt Institute. Jim, thank you so much for being with us today. Before we get started, first, I just have to say kudos to you, because I started by talking, and I often talk on the show about how I can't find anything good when I turn on the actual news. But this weekend, I saw your police officers doing the Cupid Shuffle with folks in the community. And I thought, well, look, Nebraska knows how to do it the right way. I also realized that you guys have one of the lowest unemployments in the country. And I thought, well, good thing we're talking to Jim this week, because he knows something the rest of the country doesn't. So thank you for your hand in all of that. And I don't know what your secret sauce is, but you're doing something right in middle America.
Well, we are known for Nebraska Nice, and we've had a strong public health response, but we've generally kept our economy open, and I think that's resulted in the unemployment rate that you talked about. And it's great to be here, Rebecca. I'm excited to talk about the efforts that we are having with SBN.
Well, thank you for being here. And we heard Jem Butler talk about Illinois and Georgia and how they're two different states. There's no one size fits all. Nebraska took a different approach. You guys identified an opportunity to take a big stand on how the federal government allocates CARES Act funds. What opportunity did you see, and what did your team do about it?
Yeah, this is a great example of state solutions making a national impact. And I'm excited to talk about how this all unraveled. It started by our policy director, who's a self-described policy fiscal budget nerd, looking at the CARES Act and how this was going to affect Nebraska, but more importantly, how it would affect states across the country. And she collaborated with her former colleague from North Carolina at the John Locke Foundation. And they looked at this federal legislation, and they were concerned that it did not provide the flexibility that states might need going forward to fund revenue gaps as related to COVID. And so further collaboration led to us approaching Jennifer Butler at State Policy Network to form a coalition letter from state think tank leaders. And we were amazed to get 29 state think tank leaders to sign on to this coalition letter. From that coalition letter, we leveraged that to start lobbying our federal delegation, and it resulted in bipartisan federal legislation being introduced, and that is now spreading both in
Wow.
Congress and the Senate.
That, bipartisan legislation getting introduced at the federal government is no easy feat. So that's amazing. Thank you for that. So let's back up for a second. You said
Sure.
29 other state think tanks signed on. Do you think that it helped that you guys were able to come together as a coalition? Do you think that helped spur the legislation?
Yeah, we drove the momentum, and this was a dynamic situation happening in Washington. It happened fast, and it required a dynamic network of state-based leaders to drive the policy, because not every state is the same. We have different budget needs. Nebraska has different COVID budget priorities than New York does, and this flexibility is critically important as we move forward and navigate through this landscape.
So you also mentioned bipartisan legislation. I've grown very weary of the big divide between Republicans and Democrats. It's really just makes my heart feel good to see people coming together. What do you think appealed to both sides of the aisle about this?
Well, this is common sense reform based on the needs of states dictated by state-based think tank leaders. I mean, these are common sense reforms. States need this flexibility to make sure that they're making the smart budget decisions on a statewide level or state-based level, I should say. And that's not a Republican or Democrat thing. And that's why I think that it attracted the bipartisan support.
So what exactly will enable states to use this money more wisely that's within this legislation?
Well, currently the legislation only allows you to reimburse COVID emergency expenses.
Okay.
As an example, Nebraska got 1.25 billion, but we only had 83 million. I shouldn't say only 83 million in emergency expenses, but we could fund that through our strong cash reserves. What we can't fund going forward are the revenue losses as it relates to lower sales and income tax revenue that are happening across the country. And our coalition, and that's why that letter was pushed by our two organizations and signed on by 29 leaders across the country, was to give the states the flexibility to use that federal money as they see best fit. And we're mostly concerned about the revenue losses that currently couldn't be funded through the existing legislation.
Yeah, and just to clarify, that money was coming to the states no matter what. So it wasn't a question of, do we want the money or not? It was simply give us the flexibility so we decide how to spend it best. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Gotcha. So what's next in terms of this legislation passing? You know, things always seem to take a long time, but in the middle of a pandemic, things are moving faster. So I was curious if you think that this might be a little quicker. And also, what opportunities do you see ahead in light of this?
Well, right now it's still in Congress. And there's a bill in the Senate as well, and more congressional members and senators are signing on, and the news is spreading. We got word this week that we think that it will be part of the July next round. We've been working with Jennifer Butler too, and had conversations with President Trump and his office about maybe getting guidance coming from the Treasury that will allow for this flexibility that we're asking for. So I think the momentum continues to push forward, and this momentum was driven by a great network of state-based leaders across the country.
Tracy, do you have something to add?
Well, yeah, I was thinking while Jim was talking, you know, I mentioned that 10 years ago, we started with Jennifer, Federalism in Action. And it was about 10 years ago that the SPM board hosted a retreat to really like a strategic planning session. And we invited guests to help give input. And one of those guests was the founder of the Nebraska think tank of Platt. And that's now Governor Pete Ricketts. And he was saying some of these same things, that flexibility was important, that you can't do one size fits all. Every state is different. And I know the governor is not directly involved with the think tank now, but this is where think tank leaders go on to higher office or more influence, and they can really cut their teeth and get their training at the state think tank. We have amazing leaders, of which Jim is one of the 65 out there. So I was just reminiscing about that beginning, how the mantra is every state is different and one size fits all just does not work.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tracy. And you often talk about leaders moving on to other areas of influence. And Jennifer mentioned the Vice President's office calling on SPN and this network to share our state voice. And Vice President Pence is also an example of someone who came out of this network once upon a time. So just wanted to mention that too. All right, well, Jim, thank you. This is a fantastic story. Now, you guys did initially start your collaboration with the John Locke Foundation. Is that correct? In North Carolina?
Yeah, that's exactly right. My policy director, Sarah Curry, used to work at the John Locke Foundation, and she has a close colleague still over there. And they collaborated, and their great fiscal budget minds came together, and we approached Jennifer to form this coalition letter that just continued to build. Which started out with just a few think tanks signing on, and soon enough there were 29, and each of these respective states and their leaders were contacting their federal delegation, and that led to the momentum of the federal legislation being introduced in fact, our Congressman Don Bacon here from Omaha, was the one that spearheaded the congressional bipartisan legislation that is still waiting for approval.
Well, that's awesome. I love that Nebraska and North Carolina come together to lead the way for 29 other states. So what a great story. Well, listen, let's move on to some Q&A for a little while. And there's so much work, as I understand it, going on at the federal level. I think Jen and Jim could both talk our ears off forever. So don't be shy about asking questions. I do have one question from our friend Ed Johnson, who submitted it before the show started. Ed asked how we counter steps backwards for good solutions adopted. And Ed, please put something in the chat function if I'm misunderstanding your question. But how do I say this delicately? I'm not sure of a whole lot of awesome solutions that started from the federal government. I feel like the good ones usually come more locally. So I think you might mean, in light of the pandemic and some of the great things that have happened in healthcare and the economy and even education so far, how are we going to make sure that they stay permanent? So I'd like to direct that over to you, Jim, if you're willing.
Yeah, we certainly can't turn back time as it relates to how individual states handled closing or not closing, but what we can look to the future are the policies, the free market policies that are going to help states rise from this terrible situation as fast as we can. And I look at not raising taxes, eliminating barriers like job licensing requirements and state regulations that make it harder for entrepreneurs and businesses and farmers to get back to work and get the economy going.
That makes sense. Tracy, Jen, do you guys have anything to add to that?
I think it's pretty powerful when you give people a little taste of additional freedom, even too, just the freedom, as I mentioned, just telehealth visits. And they don't want to give that back. So making sure we collect those stories about just how some of these changes, some of these deregulations impacts people's lives. So when we're on the other side of this, we can keep those wins.
Yeah, exactly. I think working to make some of these temporary deregulations, especially in healthcare, making those permanent is what a lot of these our state groups are working at diligently right now.
Yeah, I agree. One of my colleagues recently said she gave her 2-year-old ice cream for the first time. And before that, she was giving her cottage cheese and pretending like it was ice cream. And once her 2-year-old had a taste of that ice cream, she's never going back to cottage cheese. And she compared that to folks who now get to use telemedicine and no longer have surprise billing and have enough beds in a hospital because certificate of need laws were gone. And so I think, Ed, to answer your question quite simply, we want to make sure everybody has that desire and demand for more ice cream. And that's what we're working to do. Any other questions that you guys want to ask each other or anything else you want to add before we wrap up today?
I know I was wondering what the future might hold. This is like so difficult to predict when the country is in such flux. Maybe what can we look forward to or what we're hoping for in the next few months and maybe next year that developments that we hope can come out of the states for either of our speakers, if there's something your eyes are looking forward to move forward.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that first, Tracy. I mean, we've been pushing, as an example, reciprocity on job licensing in Nebraska. We had passed comprehensive job licensing reform, but we hadn't ticked that one off of our bucket list yet. And I think that, as an example, we worked with Governor Ricketts on executive order to eliminate that reciprocity or the requirement that you are based in Nebraska to be in healthcare. And we have to take a look. This should be an opportunity for our network as a state network to look at some of these on a more permanent basis. And I think reciprocity is a great example that we're going to need to get human capital and people working as fast as we can. And this is an example of something that's been on our policy priority list for quite some time. I think now, because of the landscape and because of the crisis, the policymakers in Nebraska, as an example, are going to finally take this a little bit more seriously and prioritize it.
And Rebecca asked me earlier about education. I actually think there's going to be some interesting things to come out of how parents view sending their kids to school. We're hoping that this will open up the doors for other additional education models, that parents will have additional choice on the local level. And also too, something our movement's been talking about as we've been talking to federal leaders, that any federal program that deals with education is temporary. Education is a local issue and needs to stay locally. So I'm excited to see what happens down the line, just reimagining education so all kids have access to a good quality education.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Any final questions before we wrap up the show? Tracy, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Well,
Putting you on the
I
spot.
appreciated what I think it was Jim was alluding to, it's opportunities, right? Not letting the crisis, not missing, don't let a crisis go to waste. There is opportunities for this network to be that force for good, to bring healing to communities. And we work on a lot of issues that don't necessarily, don't always sound exciting, like reciprocity of licensing and making these temporary deregulations permanent. But these deeply impact lives. With these healthcare access deregulations at the front part of COVID, it helped save lives. Getting people back to work is essential to their value as their human dignity and feeling like they can contribute and govern themselves. So hats off to our leaders that are out there day after day trying to make this happen. The work that Jim's done in Nebraska and the network effects that he tapped into by getting 29 other state think tank leaders to sign on to this. He drove that. It's where state impact in state after state can lead to national solutions. And this is the power of network effects. I'll add too, Jennifer was modest about the level of work she's done. Over the last 3 years, SPN, thanks to her leadership, has facilitated over 100 meetings at the White House and with congressional leaders to make sure that the state voice, that state policy is heard and paid attention to and integrated into the plans at the federal level. And above all, trying to get most of that devolved back to the states. So she's done yeoman's work. She's all chipper and smiley, but there's definitely days when it's a ragged job. And I know that Jim can concur that this network works really hard to stay optimistic. We work really hard to heal in our communities. We believe problems being solved closer to home is part of the answer. So hats off to our speakers. I don't know if they have any closing thoughts, but that's just what's close to my heart today.
My only closing thought is that you mentioned the terms that we use, and I use the word policy a lot, but I always think about now these are real, not even just ideas, things that solve issues in our country. And from our federal program, our effort has been creating that pipeline to take ideas that Jim and his team are developing that we know are working. Jim, and multiply that to across 65 different organizations and develop that pipeline. So we're sharing that with federal leaders. So it's just an honor to work with this network. And I just appreciate the time to share a little bit about what we're doing.
Yeah, and I will just say in closing that, so many people are frustrated with the national landscape of politics and the intensity that's going on right now. And look what we just did through a state-based network. We influence bipartisan legislation in both Congress and in the Senate. And we don't see that working necessarily anymore in Washington. And it was driven by state-based leaders, 29 state leaders across the network and across the country. That's just an amazing result that I'm proud to be a part of, not only that coalition, but this great network of State Policy Network.
Thank you. Thank you guys for this great information and the great stories you've shared today. And thank you to all of you who are tuning in, who've been supporting this network for a number of years. You guys are the reason why this network was ready when the pandemic hit. And we're ready now that the economy needs some good ideas, and it doesn't end there. We all know there are no end of pressing, difficult issues, and we are here and we'll be talking more about those in the weeks ahead. So as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, we are taking the show to every other week now that restrictions are loosening and you guys probably have less time on your hands to watch Zoom calls. So our next show will be on June 24th, and we'll be hearing about litigation efforts throughout this network, which have really also boomed in the last few years. So we'll be excited to talk with you about that. Thank you guys for making all of this possible. Please let us know what you need from us. We're here for you, and we will just keep on keeping on. Everybody have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone, take care.